Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and I think this might be the last completely overstuffed episode of releases for at least a little bit. Now, granted, it just felt like that, given how I put out another review this week, and I got a decade list I'm currently in the process of drafting. Stay tuned. But hey, this time we're all over the map, but we're still here on the Pulse. So we got 9 albums on the docket this week. Well, 8, but first let's mention from Sam Hunt, Southside. Hard to forget. I already went on about this album for over 20 minutes, full of aghast horror, disgust, and lamentation. It'll likely be the worst album that'll be released this year, if we can even call this extended debasement of entitlement a release. In a just world, every executive at MCA Nashville would be fired on the spot for criminal mismanagement. In the meantime, it's a 1 out of 10, and the sort of lazy atrocity that isn't even worth this level of attention. Let's move on to something better. And up next, from Gabe, Honky Tonk Hell.
Hauling all your money down to New Orleans. She got it. Heartbreakers, smile.
So yeah, among the indie country critics, I am late to the party with Gabe Lee, who broke out in 2018 with the lean but impressively well-written Farmland and released this project to a lot of acclaim about a month or so back, and deservingly so. Quietly, it's been a really strong year for country, and Honky Tonk Hell belongs near the top of that conversation, across the board. Hell, just on production alone, I love how varied, textured, and warm this album feels, spanning across the neo-traditional Texas honky tonks to more careful acoustics to some barn-burning southern rock. But Gabe Lee's nasal and expressive and potent singing backs it all up. His vocal timbre reminds me a little bit of Bob Dylan, but he's a better singer overall, and the well-placed female backing vocals are a great touch to augment his considerable charisma. But it's the writing that puts him in a different camp, mostly because there's a swagger and eye for detail and coaxing out some pretty compelling stories out of the standard indie pot shots at Nashville and some hard-loving relationships. I think the biggest factor to this is the framing. Mostly now he holds himself to account about as much as any of the women, so even if he's dumping her, or getting dumped, or just making bad decisions in the relationship, he's very much aware of how it all will look, and yet he still has enough rakish charm to let you sympathize regardless. I was actually really surprised when reading between the lines how much of a hellraiser he really seems to be, and he's reveling in it. Indeed, that greater sense of fun has made this album a real treat for me to revisit for the past couple of weeks. I honestly didn't want to put it on the schedule. That'd mean I would have to move on. And it also makes the more sober, observational cuts like the fantastic 30 seconds at a time or the questioning moments of escape on Imogene, highlighting the long-term costs of running away. It's just a phenomenally well-balanced album, but one that's so straightforward, I'm not sure I would have had enough material for a full video review anyway. Not that I'd get much traffic, so you know what? This winds up the best possible option. 9 out of 10, the biggest of recommendations. It's gonna slip a lot of folks by. Check this out. Next up from Olhava, Ladoga. Okay, Russian atmospheric black metal project. I first heard the 2019 album that was really just 2 extended songs and generally felt pretty impressive in terms of texture, but I will admit I was underwhelmed when it came to the melodies and structure. Suffocating cacophony is one thing, but this is a project that trends towards a drone, and that could lead to a lack of dynamics. Now this, honestly, a lot more of the same, where the howled vocals are all in Russian and drowned out midway back, but once the lyrics were translated, it did paint a pretty visceral and graphic picture of humanity sliding back to feral, animalistic behavior in the vast, savage world, of which I would argue, at this album's best, it can really drill into the overwhelming, sweeping bleakness of it all. The problem is that without a lot of melodic development and little in the way of transitions or dynamics, Olhava tends to default to very long, repetitive passages with messy and underweight drums, especially in the cymbals. And when you get an interesting bass line, it makes you wish that the album didn't slide more towards drone compositions as much as it does. It becomes easier to hear some of the fractures in that tidal wave of sound when they're overexposed and they run long. Now, that's not saying that the atmosphere isn't potent here, and if I just want the blurry waves of thunderous black metal to sit in the background, meditative amidst all the savagery, this is enhanced by some of the ambient field recordings, so it does work, but unfortunately, doesn't do much else. Still decent, so very strong 6 out of 10. If you're curious, check it out. Next up, from Yves Tumor, Heaven to a Tortured Mind. I'd argue it's not really a good sign. When I brought this album up with a few friends and they said that they liked it, but it had a whiff of critic bait around it. The sort of material that might seem challenging or thought-provoking on the surface, given the pretensions and all the genre blending, especially in the grab bag approach to electronics and then pulling from alternative rock, until you realize that the individual elements mashed together don't quite click and lead to something that's a bit less impactful than the sum of its parts. And thus I wasn't really surprised to hear that Yves Tumor was doubling down on the bombastic rock and even a little bit of soul side to even more critical acclaim, and man, I wish I was remotely impressed by this. The first obvious parallel might actually be to some of the thicker psychedelic soul cuts from the Childish Gambino Awaken My Love from 2016, but the roots of the sound is much older, linked to the swampier, obscure experimentation that exploded out of the late 60s and early 70s, as well as some very obvious Prince inspirations in the integration of more sultry rock touches. And you know what, I do remember saying that the cleaner production and mixing off of Awaken My Love did hold it back from nailing some of this atmosphere. Yves Tumor seems to have drilled into that bassy murk and piled on the blaring synth phasers, the echoing effects, and the faded mono pickups to spiral around the wiry guitar in a way that kind of reminds me more of Ariel Pink than Sly and the Family Stone, all of which I would have no problem with if the album had remembered to grab some of Pink's underrated melodies or hooks, or found a way to make Yves Tumor's voice work at all. I hate to say it, again, but it remains by far the most grating part of this work. It's creaking, it's nasal, trying to project presence but positioned too far back in the mix to command the song, and possessing rather limited expressive range or visceral power, which, if it wasn't for the occasional blast of noisier fuzz, I'd also say is true about the guitars as well. Hell, there are points in the album where he almost sounds a little like Lenny Kravitz or another import from mid-90s alt-rock, but that might be more because of the swaggering bravado in some of the subject matter, which, you know what, certainly fits into the hornier side of late 60s psychedelia and soul, but as such can feel weirdly undercooked and kind of awkward with some of its loverboy preening. It pulls from glam there, but it's not doing the Kyle Kraft thing, unfortunately. When we tack on too much compression and a weird lack of dynamics, and you know what, look, if this brand of vamping is up your alley, I can understand the appeal, I hear the quality, just not for me. 5 out of 10, only if you're curious. Next up, from Ashley McBryde, Never Will.
I don't want a number you ain't gonna answer. Let's just stick to the one night standard.
Oh, I was excited about this one. With their breakthrough in 2018 with Girl Going Nowhere, which I really should have covered, I was considerably impressed by how well she was able to step into the mainstream adjacent country scene, with enough tempered rough edges and hooks to stand out and really solid writing to boot, even with the questionable presence of Jay Joyce as a producer, but he wasn't that bad on that project. So again, I was excited for Never Will, and I really wish I loved it more. Let me get this out of the way now. In the push for greater variety, there is absolutely some gimmicky cuts and production choices made here, with Velvet Red basically sounding like a vintage 50s country song down to some of the pickups, to the utter dud that closes out the album in Styrofoam with the ugly, overcompressed groove and a lot of the spoken verses. Hate to say it, it's a bad joke, but it doesn't match the mood, and Ashley McBryde didn't even write it, and it's a terrible way to end the album. And that's really frustrating, because outside of those moments, well, I could argue the album's a bit overproduced as a whole. It's also one of those cases where Jay Joyce's experimentation can strike gold. I like the slow-burning atmospheric smolder of Shut Up Sheila that reflects the burned-out tension that can erupt at family gatherings where there's tragedy, and Voodoo Doll gets close to capturing that white-hot energy of her sultry hookup. And thankfully, for the most part, Jay Joyce does get out of the way, lending a lot of warmth and focus to the pickups for Ashley McBryde's terrific voice and eye for detail in her storytelling, most of which comes in a lot of regretful ballads and a slow burn smolder that indicates showcase just how close she is to sliding off the rails and into some dangerous territory that she might regret, which makes her dogged country rock moments like the title track hit with a lot of real punch. There's a tenacity to this album. So at the end, I'm just kind of a bit torn. The high points like One Night Standards, Sparrow, Stone, the title track, they're excellent. But the album doesn't quite feel as consistently sharp as Girl Going Nowhere, and there are some real low points this time around, but you know what, erring on the side of positive? Extremely light 8 out of 10, but absolutely worth your time. Great stuff. Next up from All Time Low, Wake Up Sunshine.
You shake things up and get the picture in your head right.
Here's a question. When I look at a new All Time Low album released on Fueled by Ramen and see a featuring credit from Black Bear, am I supposed to be excited? I mean, look, in terms of pop punk, this has never been a group that has wowed me. Most of the albums are okay, but they absolutely run together. And given the resurgence of the subgenre in the past couple of years, I had to even wonder if they could ever match up, and that places this new album in a bit of a weird spot. Yes, it's of course more synthetic than I'd prefer, look at the label, but at least the band has returned to credible pop punk after the failures of Last Young Renegade and that disastrous attempt to remake a bunch of their older songs back in 2019, and they brought the hooks back in spades, even if the band is still a little far from their peak. But here's the problem. This is a course correction rather than more of an evolution, and just going back to the mid to late 2000s template with added overproduction is not going to put you in the same tier as the emo-tinged modern bands that are currently exploding and really up my alley, but I'm also not going to lie and say that I didn't mostly enjoy this. Yeah, the lyrics are still holding this band back from being more interesting, the relationship dynamics and any references to depression or angst remain pretty flimsy and undercooked and honestly kinda generic, and I really do wish the band could learn how to mix their drums and guitar consistently. But you know what? When they take more of a compositional risk, like in cuts like Melancholy Kaleidoscope and Trouble Is, they actually stand out a little more. And at this point in their career, they could afford to do it more. Hell, the band Camino shows up on a song that's pretty solid, and the title track has some riffs and vocal delivery that kind of remind me of a mid-tier Green Day song. But outside of a pretty nice closer and basement noise, this is an album that can slide towards filler very fast in the second half, and not well produced filler at that, and will likely reside among the rest of All Time Low's albums for me, an amorphous blob of likable but not especially remarkable pop punk. So, 6 out of 10, it's your thing, check it out, just saying. Next up from Purity Ring, Womb.
Time blooming like the shadows upon you. I drown beside, floating on the water to show me your softer side. Everything is spinning beneath till it falls like glass.
So here's a duo I have not thought about in a long time, and another group for which I've never really been all that impressed. Part of this was me coming to them a little late. I went back to 2012's Shrine before I covered 2015's Another Eternities, and while they were a band that helped shift and establish some trends in the trap-inflected modern dream pop sound, they didn't really grip me more deeply, half because of the overloaded vocal filters, and half because they sacrificed some of their edge for more accessible but middling results. And yet now it's 5 years later, and well, imagine if Purity Ring continued down their path of making their sound even more mainstream accessible, and along the way lost even more personality and experimentation. Yeah, I don't know, I'm actually a little bit shocked by this. I'm not even really a fan of Purity Ring, but this either sounds like the smaller retreads of sounds they delivered with more punch years ago, or like a decent but overmixed indie pop album that could have been dropped and then forgotten about 2 to 3 years ago. It's not really boundary pushing, and for a band instrumental in establishing a sound, that is a bit alarming. You know what? It would all be fine if they were still delivering great songs. They don't have to be changing and redefining pop if the fundamentals are strong. But what this album revealed is that once you strip out so much of the abrasive gloss, the melodic hooks don't really wow me a ton here, even if you tack on the overdubs from Megan James's voice. Now, to their credit, lyrically I think Purity Ring are trying to do a little more here in some of the subtext, exploring femininity and how it's primal dramatic contrast between soft beauty and something more visceral but true, can disrupt family units or more traditional relationships, or even society on a larger level. Where the greater swell, it feels potent. If I was convinced that this album wasn't just going to venture into a lot of water-based metaphors and then swallow itself, or make the best use of its dynamics or any sense of dramatic subtlety, or if Megan James's delivery didn't feel as one-dimensional as it can here. Hell, that might be the root of my long-running problem with this duo. For as experimental and graphic as the production and content can be, James's delivery always operates in contrast to it and kind of middling. Now, I'd still argue there are more good songs than bad. Purity Ring are colorful enough lyricists to hook me pretty consistently, but let's be real, they've done better, and when you factor in the weight, I get it if it was a disappointment. So, 6 out of 10, if you're curious. Next up from Rod Wave, Pray for Love.
In the wild, wild west, this shit get dangerous. Never thought I'd see the day separate glitter from gold. Well, friends turn into foes, but it's the life that I chose.
So this was an album that I wanted to cover specifically because in the new wave of trap croon rappers, Rod Wave has had a lot of promise. He has embraced more guitars, he's got a wider and more expressive vocal range. He seemed like he was a little bit more thoughtful and he was willing to cut a little bit deeper. And while his last project, Ghetto Gospel, did start to feel a little bit one note and wrenching from softer singing to shouting across overstuffed bars, I saw a lot of potential. I wanted to hear more, and unfortunately Pray for Love can also feel a little one note. It's a good note. Rod Wave is expressive, and his melancholic balance opposite the mournful guitars and watery pianos, it is pretty consistently potent, but he doesn't exactly have a lot of distinctive hooks. And then this is a subgenre in hip-hop that kind of needs those. Roddy Ricch managed to pick that up and double down, which was great for him, especially considering how short and abbreviated many of these songs are. Often just a short intro, a verse, and an outro, no real hook. It almost feels more like a mixtape, and it doesn't help that there are some pretty obvious mastering issues too. Some songs are just abruptly quieter, or the bass is mixed to clip the edges of the mix, which is the last thing you want on a project that is so melodic. And it makes me question how much attention was paid to the details if this might have been rushed out to capitalize on chart momentum. Bizarrely, it kind of reminded me a little of Fetty Wap's debut album. Now, stay with me on this. It's melodic, it's slightly off kilter in the flow, and transitions a lot from rapping to crooning. There's questionable production, featuring rappers who tend to sound like a bit nicer guys in the streets, and can also use a little bit more variation in the fine details. Now, thankfully, while there are fewer hooks, Rod Wave is a more lyrical MC overall, and there's some poignant moments amidst all the gunplay and relationship angst, which at its best is when Rod Wave fleshes out the details and the storytelling, which is where a little more structure could absolutely help, but even then, he sells his painful come up and how hard life has left him mistrustful of friends and girls. He does start to repeat himself pretty quickly by the back half, and he definitely wears his influences on his sleeve pretty strongly, especially Kevin Gates. Now again, of the modern trap artists, I see Rod Wave having a good ear for production, and he tends to be a more interesting and likable presence overall, and this is good, but I see him capable of greatness. Let's get there, because this is a 6 out of 10, but I want to hear more. And finally, from Thundercat, It Is What It Is.
Baby girl, how do I look in my do-rag? Would you tell me the truth?
It feels like I've always talked around Thundercat and his work rather than reviewing it directly, and that's partially because it's been a little tricky for me to get a true handle on it. I like the jazzy funk of the bass and some of the oddball synths. I like the persistent sense of humor. They're definitely easy projects to appreciate, and I completely see the synergy that's come between Thundercat's work with Flying Lotus, but I've yet to be completely wowed by a Thundercat album, mostly due to questions of structure, where I've wished the fragmented ideas were explored with a little bit more depth. And I've never been enamored with some of his vocals, and while Drunk was a good step in that direction by simply adding more interlocking pieces to the puzzle, I was encouraged that this new album seemed to be tightening things back up, and well, I'm a little conflicted. On the one hand, if you like Thundercat's trademark expert bass work with a little bit more comforting poise on more developed songs, this does seem to be a step in that direction, especially given how loose and fun a lot of his lyrics remain. A little bit less cohesive in the album's concept, but there's still a lot of loose charm to the silliness here. And while the percussion and bass mixing can absolutely be inconsistent and kind of muddy, there is a lot of liquid charm to a lot of these songs, especially when the album makes a pivot in the final third to a very sincere and well-handled sweet paying tribute to the late Mac Miller, where I have to point out, Ty Dolla $ign just sounds fantastic on his verse. Now, that's not saying the album doesn't have its moments that just don't match with the vibe as well. I found the inclusion of the King of the Hill from a previous Brainfeeder compilation kind of baffling, given how its darker rejection of hedonism kind of flies in the face of the more upbeat and better moments here. And it's not the first point where the subversion of that vibe kind of feels awkward, but overall, there is something comforting about slipping into the resigned but very warm and likable tones and atmosphere on this project. It doesn't quite feel as ambitious as Drunk, but it succeeds with the lower stakes, and I wound up going back to this a fair bit. Really good stuff. Solid 7 out of 10. Check this out. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Got through a lot of albums this week. I'm expecting a little less next week as I'm continuing to work on my best hit songs of the 2010s, so stay tuned for that. Probably next week or two. I've been struggling to get all that together. It's a big video. But beyond that, if you guys actually have any comments, links down there below. And if you want to help support me on this channel, which again, I fully get it, tough times for everybody right now, but link to my Patreon right over there, I'd be very grateful. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.